everyone, to the latest edition of What's the Story, Old Glory, our first YouTube episode. We're excited to have you with us. Good morning, Todd. How are you?
Good morning. Well, now we can sort of semi-show the beautiful weather here in Tauranga if I pull the curtains back. But yes, welcome everybody. We've had a lot of feedback that not only do you like listening to our dulcet tones, or at least Elizabeth's dulcet tones, you would much prefer having a YouTube option as well. So that's what we've started, and hope you enjoy it.
Yeah, and we've decided to start on probably the biggest guest that we've ever had on What's the Story, Old Glory. We're so privileged to have this guest join us. So why don't you introduce the interview, Todd?
Certainly. So this morning, New Zealand time, we have an interview with Ambassador John Bolton. John Bolton was the UN ambassador for George W. Bush when he was the president. And more recently was President Trump's national security advisor in the first term, and wrote a remarkable fly on the wall kind of book called In the Room Where It Happened, which has got a huge acclaim. Regular contributor to CNN and other global news outlets and occasional podcasts. And we pitched the idea that New Zealanders would be very interested in his take on what's going on in the world. And I'm sure you'll enjoy the interview as much as we did.
We might as well start with the news that we have woken up to here in New Zealand around the call that President Trump and President Putin had overnight for us. And we've just having a look at the statement that came out of the White House from Press Secretary Leavitt this morning. She said that the blood and treasure that both Ukraine and Russia have been spending in this war would be better spent on the needs of the people. This conflict should never have started, should have ended long ago with sincere and good faith peace efforts. And then goes on to say that the two leaders agreed that a future with an improved bilateral relationship between the United States and Russia has a huge upside. This includes enormous economic deals and geopolitical stability when peace has been achieved. What are your comments and thoughts on that?
Well, most of it's complete nonsense. Let's talk about the question of the war itself first. The Ukrainians don't think this conflict is senseless, which is what President Trump called it in his State of the Union message. They are fighting for their freedom and independence. The United States once fought for its freedom and independence too, and we didn't think it was senseless at the time. And as for the notion that better Russian-U.S. relations will bring big economic deals, number one, that's an interesting theory, which since the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union hasn't happened for 35 years. It may in the future, but the level of trade between the U.S. and Russia has never been very significant, even at its highest point. And the fact is, the country that needs economic relief is Russia from the sanctions they've been under for the last 3 years following their invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Now, that statement wasn't written by the Kremlin, but it's pretty close.
So, Ambassador, how do you think Europe is going to respond to this? You've seen the various meetings between Zelensky and the European leaders, Mark Carney, of course, over there in recent days. Give us a sense of what options are in front of Europe to respond in any different way to what President Trump is doing.
Well, as I understand it, the concrete outcome of the talks is that Russia's agreed to suspend attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure for 30 days. So what does that amount to? Number one, that is not a ceasefire. It means the war continues. It means a certain target set will not be hit if the Russians abide by the commitment, but it frees up their capacity to hit other targets. Maybe they were fresh out of energy targets anyway. But nobody should mistake this for a ceasefire. And I'm sure people are going to say, but at least they're not hitting energy targets. Well, that's great unless, say, you're a Ukrainian soldier at the front lines who's now going to face increased Russian attacks because they might try to get a breakthrough in your sector of the the front. It buys Russia 30 more days. And interestingly, in the readout from the Kremlin, the official readout, it also said that clearly what Putin put on the table was he wants a suspension of all military aid to Ukraine, including intelligence assistance, as a precondition for an ultimate peaceful resolution. Well, that obviously is the Kremlin's position. That is exactly what Donald Trump did to Ukraine after the debacle in the Oval Office with Zelensky a couple of weeks ago. So Putin, in textbook style KGB manipulation, took something that Trump has already done, clearly already feels comfortable with doing, and said, I want it, and I want it permanently. So, we will now have, during the rest of the day here in the United States, leaks from various people in the government, leaks from Europe, from conversations people are having, and we may get a fuller understanding of this, something like 2.5 hour plus conversation that the two leaders had. It's not really 2.5 hours, of course, because half of that's translation, but it's still, let's say, an hour and a quarter, an hour and a half of talk between the two leaders. And I'm sure they covered a lot of other subjects that were not included in the readout.
Does Europe have a choice ultimately if Trump and Putin agree terms which are mineral related, meets, as you're suggesting, pretty much everything Putin would want from a negotiation perspective? If Trump says fine, does Europe have any other recourse?
Well, if the Europeans are capable of supplying Ukraine with weapons and ammunition and other assistance that they need to continue the war, then I think they do have another course. Europe is, I love the Europeans. I'm a strong supporter of NATO. Let me just put it this way. Europe is strong on rhetoric and weak on performance when it comes to security issues. So we've heard they've been pounding their chest. That's great. Let's see what they come up with. If Ukraine can show we can continue this war, then I think you have the chance for an even negotiation. But I thought from the beginning a ceasefire was a mistake for Ukraine to accept. I think the Russians want the ceasefire. Their military has not performed well. They've suffered a huge human cost to double the Ukrainian territory they hold. The former U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said 2 years ago now, the Russians are feeding their army into a wood chipper. That's fine with the United States. We could see that go on for a long time. Russia can't do that. So both sides probably need a pause. Russia needs it more because its objective, let's be clear, is incorporating Ukraine into the new Russian Empire. So we may have what's called a permanent settlement in 6 months after negotiation. But if Russia doesn't invade for a third time in 5 or 6 years, I'll be very surprised. That's why Zelensky has focused on the need for either NATO membership or NATO security guarantees, both of which Donald Trump has already ruled out.
So you've said before that Trump's national security policies are based on instinct, his personal relationships with foreign leaders, and his showmanship. Does Trump want peace, or is it more about that transaction, what deal he can make on the day?
Well, he can't make many deals economically with Russia in a state of war with the sanctions that we have imposed on Russia. And it's a fantasy to think, as some of Trump's supporters in this country have argued, that making peace in Ukraine will somehow peel Russia away from China. That is an objective that's worthwhile. I think it's the growing China-Russia axis is a menace worldwide. So the notion that we want to separate the two of them is important, but it's not going to happen by ending the war in Ukraine. This is something that's been happening for quite some number of years. The war in Ukraine has strengthened the Chinese-Russia relationship to the detriment of everybody in Asia and Europe. And so I think it's very short-sighted to think that somehow we'll split them apart here. This is not the way to open a negotiation. This is a way really of foreclosing discussion on the part of the Ukrainians. This is exactly what they had feared, that the peace is being negotiated over their heads.
Ambassador, many of our Kiwi listeners have asked us in somewhat vernacular terms at times, what's driving Trump to act in a manner that seems in opposition to America's long-term interests and certainly history. Is there a grand plan to divide the world into spheres and retreat into protectionism? You know, we're a little country at the bottom of the world, rules-based order, free trade's a big thing for us. There's a lot of anxiety at this part of the world around Trump's strategy. Could you give us a view on what that would look like?
Yeah, he doesn't have a strategy. He doesn't have a philosophy. He doesn't do grand strategy. He doesn't even do policy as we conventionally understand that term. For Trump, the world is a world of one transaction after another. It's like buying one plot of land at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 60th Street. And the next day you buy a plot of land at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 61st Street. Each deal's different. Each deal's separate. You're trying to maximize your profits. That's your life. Uh, he is ad hoc, episodic, and transactional, but he sees things through the prism of what benefits Donald Trump. All politicians think about their political and sometimes economic interests. That's all Trump thinks about. There isn't any through line here. His defenders say he's playing a complex game of three-dimensional chess. No, he's not. He's playing chess one move at a time, and he doesn't look beyond that. It's a very narrow view of the world, and it rests in part on what he has frequently said publicly, that if he has good relations with Vladimir Putin, for example, good personal relations, then the U.S. has good relations with Russia. And the converse of that is he have bad relations with somebody, as he does with Zelensky, then the U.S. has bad relations with Ukraine. He thinks Putin is his friend. He has said this. Tulsi Gabbard, who is remarkably unqualified to be our director of national intelligence, but who is, said the other day, Putin and Trump are very good friends. I will tell you, there is not a grain of truth in American intelligence that says that. Trump thinks that Putin and he have a mutual relationship. Putin thinks Trump is an easy mark, and he has used, and he undoubtedly did it in this call today, all the techniques of a KGB foreign agent to manipulate Trump. He's done it successfully since the election. He set this call up in the hopes that a direct conversation between him and Trump would get Russia more concessions than they've already gotten, rather than let lower level, mere ministers of foreign affairs negotiate the ceasefire. He wanted to do it directly with Trump because he knew who the easiest target was. And again, we don't have a full readout, but I'm confident that the more we learn, the worse it's going to get.
Mm. You mentioned China earlier, and although Trump's administration and many of his supporters are ostensibly anti-China, there is concern that his actions are actually playing into China's hands. For instance, reducing US aid creates a vacuum in many parts of the world that China might step into. Here in New Zealand, China's been flexing its muscle in the Tasman Sea with warships, which is causing quite a bit of concern. So do you think that we down here in the South Pacific should be concerned about China's expansion?
Absolutely. And I think they have a clear vision of what they want to do, which is achieve hegemony in the littoral waters around China first, up to the first island chain in East Asia, the South China Sea, and Southeast Asia, and then expand into the Pacific. All of their efforts through the Belt and Road Initiative and other steps against the small island nations have unfortunately made a lot of progress. I think we've all woken up to it and are taking countermeasures now, but they've got a head start. So why in the campaign did Trump have rhetoric that was negative about China? Because he thinks China cost him the 2020 election. He blames China for COVID. I'm not saying he thinks they deliberately unleashed COVID on the world, but he believes, and so do many others, including myself, that it came from a leak from the Wuhan laboratory. I've had my questions ever since 2020 whether this was an overt research program that ultimately tied into China's clandestine biological weapons program, and it just got out of control. But Trump may well be correct. The U.S. economy was doing pretty well going into 2020, bodes well for Trump's reelection. COVID comes, the economy shuts down, people get unhappy, and Trump loses. So he's negative on China because it hurt him personally. But during 2018 and 2019, before COVID, he also wanted to negotiate what he endlessly called the biggest trade deal in history with China. And his negotiators made efforts, ultimately unsuccessfully, and it led to tariffs against China at the end of his term. But he's still, in the back of his mind, is thinking of the biggest trade deal in history. So what comes out of the White House today, our time, but that he expects Xi Jinping is going to visit Washington very shortly. Just like after his first call with Putin, he said he wanted to go to Moscow and he wanted Putin to come to Washington. Thus, even then, removing Putin from the purgatory he had been in since the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. That's what Trump wants. He wants the publicity of the personal meeting, the meeting at the summit with Xi Jinping and with Vladimir Putin. It doesn't matter to him what the substantive outcome is. He wants the publicity.
So how do we deal with it as a little country at the bottom of the world, with China overtly stretching into our sphere, obviously in the South Pacific? And we know that when you were the national security advisor for Trump, we've read in your book about your very strong anti-China view and the desire for America to really protect this part of the world as being its sphere. Our concern, sir, is that Trump looks like he could disregard this area like he is doing to Europe, and simply not support or resist China's inexorable move into the South Pacific. And that has huge impacts for our country.
Well, I think in the immediate future, the question of tariffs, I think New Zealand did get some exemptions from the steel and aluminum tariffs back in 2018, and I think you've got to make the case for those. You've got an excellent ambassador in Washington, and Rosemary Banks. I think she'll do a great job, but the government needs to focus on that. And then you need to find a way to make the case to Trump why it's in his personal interest not to let China gain hegemony over the South Pacific. Forget about New Zealand's national interest. Forget about America's national interest. Explain what's in it for Donald Trump. I recommended that President Zelensky nominate Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize and do it before somebody else stole the idea. So if you can think of something comparable to that, do it.
Or black jersey or something?
Something like that. Yeah, that well, I don't know. His son's a big soccer fan. Maybe you can convert him to rugby too. I don't, whatever your sport of choice is. But when he was in the White House in his first term, I had arranged a meeting with the heads of state of Palau, the Marshall Islands, and Micronesia to come and visit him in the White House. And it was the first time any of them had met an American president. And I just thought it was important to have the meeting as a gesture. And of course, Trump never reads briefing paper, but I had been around long enough. I was prepared. I went into his office right before the meeting. He looked at his schedule. He said, "Why am I meeting these people?" So I took out a map of the three island nations, and I put it down on the table. And then I laid over it a glassine map of the United States. And the total territory of the three island states is just about as big as the continental United States. And I said, that's why, because of China. And he looked at it and he said, this is talking about land now, property. He looked at it and said, I've got it. And he went in, he was completely charming with the three heads of state. They left the White House walking on air. And at least for that moment, it was a recognition on his part that the South Pacific was important to the United States. So it is possible, but just bear in mind, he has a short attention span. So you've got to get his attention and make your point and hope that it sticks. And it's worth trying to repeat it, wash and rinse and repeat once every 6 months or so.
So our foreign minister is meeting with Marco Rubio today in Washington, D.C. So does the conversation with Marco Rubio go differently from the conversation that he would have with Trump, for instance, if that was to happen? And would, if he is able to convince Rubio about the importance of this part of the world and the threat that China poses, will Rubio be able to then convince Trump of that? How does that relationship work?
Well, the second part of your question actually is more important than the first. Based on his performance, I've known Marco for a long time. I think he absolutely understands what's at work in the Pacific and supports a stronger American military, a bigger Navy so that we can confront the geographic reality of the Pacific Ocean, which we don't have enough naval warships at sea now. We need many more. That's going to take time to do. I think Rubio would be a strong supporter of the AUKUS nuclear submarine problem. I understand New Zealand's view on the nuclear issue. Maybe we can talk about that at a different time. But Rubio's personal views, based on his past performance, I don't think are the issue. The question is what he can convince Trump of. And I hope your foreign minister and Rosemary, when they go in to see him tomorrow, are focused on helping Rubio make the case to Trump that New Zealand and the South Pacific are in his interest. And he would look very bad if China stole a march on us.
Final question for us, Ambassador. We obviously have been following in our podcast here in New Zealand the events of the last 18 months in America. And a lot of our listeners are aghast at how the Republican Party has changed so significantly from the party that it used to be, the party that you were a big part of over the years. Is the Republican Party of George W. Bush, Reagan, is it gone? Is the MAGA movement complete in its victory, or will in time the Republican Party reemerge?
Now, I'm here to tell you that the Republican Party is still a Reaganite policy, a foreign policy party. Trump's had an enormous intimidating effect on people. He is the president just 2 months into his new term. A lot of Republicans in Congress don't want to oppose him, but I talk to a lot of them, and they tell me privately that they still believe in the Reagan-Bush approach. So that's the good news and the bad news. They don't believe what Trump's saying, but they're not willing to stand up and say it publicly. But we're a long way from finished here, and the best thing I can ask from the people of New Zealand is just grit your teeth a little bit here and let us work our way through it. We've got a ways to go, and Trump's going to cause damage. But as my former boss Jim Baker always used to tell me, keep your eyes on the prize, and the prize is the long-term security for both New Zealand and the United States. And I'll just close with the famous Winston Churchill thought that where he said, you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing, usually after they've tried everything else. So we're in the trying everything else part. Just give us a little time here.
Thank you very, very much, Ambassador. We really appreciate your time today.
Thank you
for joining us. Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you. Wow. Be fair to say we thoroughly enjoyed that. What was your initial take from that, Elizabeth?
Well, I feel very fortunate that we were able to get him today of all days, given that there was that historic discussion between the Kremlin and the White House, Putin and Trump, that happened overnight New Zealand time. And so we literally woke up to the breaking news as to what came out of the discussion. So to have his insights on that and to hear what he has to say about the unfolding situation in Ukraine, he knows exactly the way Trump's mind works, has been very close to the man. And so it's just, yeah, I'm still sort of tingling, if I can put it that way, to get insights from a man such as him.
Yeah, I found, to be honest, you know, reflecting on the sort of the Trump persona and the sheer transactional nature of his presidency, you know, the sense that he will just cut a deal with Putin. Putin's already negotiated pretty much everything he wants. He will, you know, yes, there'll be a 30-day ceasefire that the energy assets won't be hit, but he'll still make more advances on the ground. Then he'll come back and ask for more. And this sort of sense that Trump, as long as he sees the war stopped, gets access to some of Ukrainian minerals, that'll be fine for him. And I thought it was really interesting, his probably fair, frankly, assessment that as much as Europe's going to talk about not accepting a deal which sees the Ukrainian borders fundamentally conceded like Putin wants, they're really not going to be able to do much without it. For Europe to rearm, it's going to take many, many years. They heavily rely on American armaments, American systems, intelligence. There'll be a lot of talk, of course, from Europe and frustration and alignment with Zelensky, but ultimately, if Trump and Putin cut a deal, however distasteful in the ambassador's eyes, that will be the deal that gets cut.
Yeah, and he clearly knows a lot about this part of the world as well, and how the geopolitics will affect us, particularly in relation to China. And he's got some very clear views on Chinese expansion, and that's a bad thing for the world. Again, very timely, the fact that our Foreign Minister Winston Peters is meeting with Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, later today, and the fact that Rubio will understand it, but that he has to convince Trump of the importance of this part of the world and what Chinese expansion means. I found that anecdote he told about Micronesia and having to demonstrate to Trump things in terms of property deals and what that means as a way of getting information inside his head directly before a meeting was really fascinating. Heard these things and things that I've read, but to be able to hear it from the horse's mouth, for want of a better phrase, was really interesting as well.
Yeah, and I thought you got a great insight from him there when his advice essentially for our Foreign Minister, Winston Peters, who I think everyone can see is a great asset for New Zealand in the foreign affairs space. He's over there now talking to Marco Rubio, and how do you get a sense that Marco Rubio is going to totally get the challenge of China's expansion into this part of the world, what this means for New Zealand, Australia, and the South Pacific, and the need for America to be quite muscular in response. But to get Trump's commitment to this area, somehow we've got to come up with either a football jersey for Barron, or some sort of link to him personally, almost, so he can see the benefit commercially for expanding America's influence in this part of the world, which is just so remarkable, isn't it? Driven by totally a commercial America first lens, not really interested in alliances or history or anything like that.
Yeah, and another piece of breaking news that's just come out overnight about the Ukraine and Russia is that the US have ended a program that was tracking children who have been kidnapped and trafficked out of Ukraine into Russia, potentially 35,000 children unaccounted for that have been taken into Russia, and the US have stopped the funding for that program. So that's quite alarming. But again, having a program like that would have no commercial benefit to Trump. I'm not even going to say America, but to Trump. He wouldn't see why that's important in terms of negotiating a transactional deal. So I guess that's an example of what that means in practice.
Josh, he was really scathing of Trump, wasn't he, in terms of his lack of strategy, lack of policy. Yeah. Quite optimistic that the Great American Project will continue despite Trump, and that it'll be 4 lumpy years, but America will pop out the other side, and we've just got to work out how to essentially hunker down and maximize our interests through seeing it through the lens of what Trump wants, which again, this is not a partisan podcast. And it's certainly not in a New Zealand context, but I was reading for our New Zealand listeners overnight, the Minister Peters, our Foreign Minister, very much taking an approach of outlining what we do as terms of New Zealand and the Pacific and our relationships and connections, but very much listening to the American expectation of us, no doubt of Australia, of this part of the world. And that seems very aligned to what Ambassador Bolton was suggesting New Zealand should do. Realistic, I think. We're a small nation, tub thumping about, the pluses and minuses of Trump's strategy is not going to work for us. We need to sort of navigate in a way where we have a clear picture of what is expected of us.
And that echoes the advice of Professor Patman that we heard from recently as well, in terms of what the future role for small and medium-sized economies will be in the Trumpocene era, as it is. Fascinating stuff. So, and another breaking news overnight, some of our listeners may have been keeping track of what's been happening with Trump's use of wartime legislation to deport people back to Venezuela, I think it was, by saying that they're members of criminal gangs. And this videos went up of them going on a plane. A federal judge said that that was illegal, that you cannot invoke wartime legislation in this manner, and that the plane should be diverted back to the US. In response to that, Trump said that the actions of his administration in this respect are completely legal, and said that perhaps federal judges who decide against him like this should be impeached. This has led to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court putting out a very rare press statement. They hardly ever do this, to say that there is absolutely no legal precedent or any legal way for a judge to be impeached. It's not appropriate for politicians to be talking about judicial decisions such as this in this way. It's against the traditional separation of powers doctrine, and it's just quite alarming that a Supreme Court that is stacked in Trump's favor in terms of the conservative bench is finding it necessary to put out press statements against the president's position. We're again in uncharted territory here.
Yes, absolutely, it's alarming, but at one level it gives me confidence, because we've been talking previously about him just pushing and pushing and pushing, and will the Constitution actually fight back, for better words, and arguably that it has overnight.
The guardrails are holding in that respect.
Exactly, good point, with the Chief Justice saying, well, hang on a minute, that's totally inappropriate. You can't just because a federal judge has come up with something you don't like, you can't threaten to impeach the person. That is dictatorship. Didn't use those words, but as you say, the guardrails are holding. So it's extraordinary. It's remarkable. Hence why we are doing this every week. And next week we'll be back with another guest. And after our experience with Ambassador John Bolton, we'll keep trying to find guests who are really willing to give a sense of what on earth is going on over there, because we know that's an attractive question for a lot of New Zealanders at the moment. Give us hope that actually America can get through this, and we can all get through this.
Absolutely.
Well, from a beautiful early morning here in Tauranga, hope you have a lovely day, and until we catch up again, haere.
And from an equally beautiful morning here in Oamaru, mā te wā.